Welcome to the BTS Presents show.
Hi, I'm Candace Bradfield, broker and owner of Bradfield and Associates, and past president of our Santa Cruz County Association of Realtors. I want to thank you for joining BTS Presents. We're going to be talking about the Santa Cruz County and Silicon Valley real estate.
Hello and welcome to this segment of BTS Presents Silicon Valley and Santa Cruz real estate behind the scenes. I'm the host of this segment, Datta, Khalsa, and I'm joined by a panel of 5 local citizens and activists who care enough to speak up on our housing affordability crisis and specifically desperate measures that are being proposed to address these issues. So I'm joined on the far right by, or the far left, I guess, if we're talking politically, by Jeffrey Smedberg, co-author of the proposed rent control ordinance, which is being circulated for petition right now. Also, Brent Adams, he's an advocate for the homeless and program director for the Warming Center. Next is Darius Mohsenin. He's a major provider of housing, not only in Santa Cruz, but in the greater Monterey Bay area. And Stacey Falls, who is also a member of Movement for Housing Justice and very active in the proposed rent control ordinance as well. And then finally, last but not least, Peter Cook, a fellow real estate broker and housing provider as well. So thank you all for joining this evening, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion. I suppose we should start with Jeffrey, since we wouldn't be here largely if not for this ordinance that you proposed. So would you like to speak a little bit as to what the ordinance is and what you're doing right now to put it forward?
Sure. I'm part of the Movement for Housing Justice, which is a community coalition that was formed last fall. Community organizations and individuals, some labor unions, including my labor union, the Service Employees International, and trying to think of what to do to address some of the critical housing issues. And we decided to, and this actually followed on a lot of community canvassing, neighborhood walking, and asking people what are the issues that are facing you. And what we heard over the course of last year, 2017, in every neighborhood that we went to, people were bringing up the housing issues. And so we tried to figure out what area of the housing issue we could tackle. And certainly it's a very broad and complex issue, and housing supply and so forth, housing demand are really big. But what people in the neighborhoods are feeling is insecurity about just being able to stay in their home because of occasional arbitrary evictions and occasional and sometimes unexpected rent increases. And so people in town who were renting were not, I mean, there are certainly many exceptions with people who had long-term relationships with landlords, but there were plenty of people we ran into who just weren't sure how long they were going to get to stay in their house. And so we decided to work on a rent control measure. That's the way that we're proceeding.
Okay, and I understand it's being circulated for petition right now. It needs something like, is it 37?
It's actually,
how many?
It's about 5,500 signatures. I don't know the exact count.
And where are you in the process in terms of getting the number of signatures that you need?
Yeah, well, we started collecting signatures early in February, and we're pretty much on track to collect those signatures.
So next is Brent, who's very active in addressing issues of homelessness, and they're separate but related issues, obviously. Do you want to speak to any the similarities or the links between the housing crisis and homelessness, and then obviously the distinctions and perhaps some of the I guess the unconscious bias that a lot of people have towards the homelessness.
Probably for the first time ever, I'm going to try to keep my comments brief, mainly because you have housing providers and rent control activists here, and so I feel I am a little bit outside of the context, except for what you just brought up and also what Jeffrey brought up, is the reason there's desperation around it is because when one finds oneself out of housing, all of a sudden you drop off a cliff into this class designation of houselessness, homelessness. People who sleep outside in their vehicles, doubling up in cars, in other houses, and that is a notion I like to address with my work with the Warming Center, but in the larger context of homeless advocacy around paradigm shift, around our awareness that something we have a historical concept of the nomad or the landless that we still have with us today. Without agency or legitimacy of housing, a person is not even a half person; they're a non-person. And addressing that, the fact that we are here around the rental issue and the housing issue, the reason there is desperation and it's a crisis is because one would never want to cross over that line. And if we could really challenge that notion and become more aware that everyone who sleeps outside in cars, they're humans too, they're actually our people.
Instead of labeling them, I mean, as soon as you call somebody homeless, you have this whole bias against everything that comes with it. I mean, the same way that if you call somebody a landlord, it evokes, some medieval lord, with his turkey leg saying, "Fetch me my wench." When you have these responsible, they're housing providers.
It's a feudal system.
And these are, homeless. What would be a more responsible term than calling somebody homeless?
Well, we call them people who sleep outside, typically, or
basically what it is.
You always, no matter what, always lead with the term person or people, like people with physical mobility challenges rather than a handicapped person.
Right.
There's no type of homeless person that comes out of the womb and now they're just homeless. And the real challenge is once we societally, individually start labeling ourselves, we as a community don't let them people wash that label off. Once homeless, always homeless, in a way. And we really have to just start to acknowledge that we're doing that unintentionally. And how do we stop doing that? Realizing that they're not. We're always saying, why are they coming here? But the data shows, the pit count shows, and we're not actually matching all the point in time counts all over the nation to show that almost every community has 50 to 75% of people who have become homeless in that town and were not homeless within 5 or 10 years, and 25% that actually grew up and were born in that community. So what we're really saying is, these are our people. This is us. And when we start thinking about it like that, then we actually shift all the ways that we start looking at it.
Maybe start caring, for example.
Start caring in a different way, even. Yeah. That we're not giving to a homeless person, we're giving to somebody who is really our community member.
So what's your biggest project, or what's the biggest thing you'd like to accomplish, say, this year?
We're starting a storage program. One of the designations that people who sleep outside have is that they're carrying their belongings around, their bedding, their carts. You see it all around, and that actually is like kind of a third world sort of look. In one of the costliest places on the planet here in Santa Cruz, and yet we're surrounded by a third world visual experience. People sleeping in doorways. Well, we can really lighten the load literally by providing a storage program. So the Warming Center program, which is a nonprofit I direct, and it's an extreme weather shelter, we're starting a storage program in the next month.
That's cool. And I think it mirrors things that are happening in other cities. Fast Company, which I subscribe to, has been highlighting homeless issues as well as housing crisis issues, and they've spoken of a project that's been proposed by, I think it's an architect from Denmark, and they are looking at ways of building dignified housing pods, basically, that are up against the sides of existing buildings. And the cost of providing each of those is about $15,000, which is about 1/10 what it costs to provide a shelter, a shelter bed or low-income housing. So it's nice to see somebody doing things locally here, and I really appreciate you being here. So next, I guess I'll move it over to Darius. You're probably as qualified as anybody to speak as a provider of housing in the area. How long have you owned housing in the area and provided it to the community?
I actually bought my first rental property in Santa Cruz 1 year out of college, 1986.
Which college was that?
Carnegie Mellon. I got my bachelor's and master's degrees in electrical engineering. Worked over the hill. I came out from central Pennsylvania. I did my 4 seasons living.
Yeah.
Been there, done that. And worked in all the various defense companies in the Bay Area, in Silicon Valley, and had a sort of a parallel career in investment real estate. And yeah, I bought this property for, at the time, a princely sum of $140,000.
And so flash forward now, you have how many rental units between here and Moderator?
Okay, so I have, there's an amalgam. Myself, I have 26 units in Vacaville, 53 units here in Santa Cruz, and this includes some family partnerships as well as my own. 12 units in Salinas, 19 units in San Leandro,
Okay.
and a single family home in Sunnyvale, when I originally lived in. So I've worked with multiple locations, and we'll be eventually, I'm sure, touch upon Section 8, multiple housing authorities in the different counties as well.
So you do subsidize, you have a lot of subsidized Section 8 housing?
Half, here's another thing, I'm a big believer in housing is kind of a healthcare issue. We should be looking at it. It's also the foundation for just everything: employment, mental health, and I've seen lives change.
Yeah.
I've had VASH. I'm familiar with VASH vouchers, but this is the veteran assistance. They can get a Section 8 voucher within 3 to 6 months.
It's a great program.
I've had 4 VASH tenants. I've seen their lives literally change, and they've become employed. They've gotten off the street.
Well, it's basically
So
what
I'm a
Brent
big
talked
believer.
about, from having dropped off the edge, being brought back on.
Right.
They can really set roots.
And so half of my tenants in Santa Cruz, 23, are Section 8 tenants.
Wow.
And some of my best tenants are Section 8 tenants.
So speaking as a property owner and a housing provider, how would this proposed rent control ordinance, and how's the current rent freeze, how's that impacting you and your tenants potentially?
Me, honestly, it doesn't affect me that much. I think my rents are fair. They're near market. The most concern I have about the proposed ordinance is the eviction controls. They're quite draconian compared to rent control in other jurisdictions.
Right.
They seem to be. It's the transfer of control of the property from landlord to tenant is what it does. And what happens if you've got a bad actor as a tenant? The problem is, it's not so much the landlord's issue; it's the neighbors, the neighboring tenants. I don't live there. I don't have to live next to the guy having traffic come at 2, 3, 4.
But if you get a complaint,
but the neighbors do, and they say, "Why can't you get this guy out of here? He's dealing drugs. He's doing this. He's that. He's pimping." I get all kinds of stuff. It's like, look, you guys are in California. You're our tenants. You have a lot of rights. This isn't Russia. I can't go over there with a gun and kick him out and put him on the street. There's a whole process to this, and frankly, it's quite difficult to evict a tenant for things other than non-payment of rent.
as it is right now, even without that ordinance?
Oh, yes.
Okay, and then the ordinance does what? As I understand it, there are 12 specific reasons, exemptions that are granted, and end of a lease term is not one of those. So the lease ends.
Right now, yes, we can do, a 3-day notice. There's 3 notices for terminating a tenancy. 3-day notice, perform non-payment rent. I should take 4 notice. 3-day notice, perform covenant or quit. That's, behave yourself. 30-day notice to less than a year tenancy, and 60-day notice. Actually, a 90-day notice if there's Section 8. So that's basically your available options as a landlord.
But not now, apparently.
No, that's now. That's
Okay.
now. And so if you can't get somebody out on a 3-day notice for bad behavior, give them a 30 or 60-day notice, and then that's solid. Then you can go to court. It's like you're holding over. You got the gavel comes down, you're evicted. However, with the new ordinance, that's no longer the case. It's not that simple. And my concern is, bad tenants, bad actors can just continue their misdeeds
And
it's not me that suffers. I live
Right.
over by the yacht harbor. I don't have to listen to it. I don't have to deal with it. I don't have to see them coming and going. I don't have to see the trash they leave. It's my other tenants that are affected. That's who I care about.
Well, that makes a perfect segue to Stacey.
Well, I actually
So-
wanted to ask a question. Like, seriously, if somebody is engaged in felony activity, they are running a prostitution ring out of their apartment, you don't have any legal recourse to get them to leave?
It's a landlord's burden of proof to prove it. So I give them a 3-day notice. Stop your drug dealing. Guess what? They stop the drug dealing on day 4. Okay? Day 5, they start doing it again. So it's back to another 3-day notice, rinse and repeat. And so you go to court, And it's kind of like a he said, she said, unless you have really, good, solid evidence, either police reports, possibly bring other tenants to court to vouch for them. But tenants don't want to come.
So
and
currently,
be
you
a
basically
snitch.
tough it out till the end of the lease, and then you say, okay, the lease is over without recourse, and then it goes. And if they had the proposed rights under the new proposed ordinance, this wouldn't necessarily be a possibility. So you'd be more in court.
It would be it just adds that another level of difficulty to the process if you have getting rid of a bad tenant.
Well, we've given you plenty of mic time. I'll bring Stacey forward.
Interested.
And so
I'm a renter, so it's interesting to see the perspective from the other side.
I think it's terrific having everybody. I mean, we have a really good sampling of people here. So, speaking from the renter's perspective and from somebody very active in the movement for housing justice. So, how do you see it, and what were your thoughts in terms of forming the? What was your objective for the movement for housing justice, and what are you specifically doing to put that forward?
Yeah, well, so some people might know that I worked with Brent for a couple years on getting Sanctuary Camp and then the Warming Center, so I saw a lot of people who were feeling desperate because they had zero housing.
Yeah.
And more recently, it's become really obvious to me that even middle class people are feeling desperate.
No question.
These
poor people in Silicon Valley can't afford to buy a house unless they make $375,000. I'm like, really?
Well, I'm a teacher, and I have a lot of colleagues who are moving out of town because of rent increases, and I have colleagues who used to walk to work and now they're driving in from way out of town. And I think if you have middle class people who don't have any stability in this town, who's got the stability? I mean, who's feeling like they can live here?
Right. Where do the nurses live? Where do the teachers live?
Well, all the nurses live in Watsonville. I
Right.
just was talking to somebody who organizes the nurses union, and I think he said like almost none of them actually live in Santa Cruz. They all commute in from
Right.
Watsonville, and so it became really obvious to me when my neighbor of 8 years literally had her rent doubled over the course of 2 years. And, this was this person that was a great neighbor, really, solid middle class person who said, I can't stay here.
Right.
And pretty soon everybody I knew, their rents were going up. They were being asked to leave the house that they'd been in for 5, 10, 17 years.
Yeah.
And I started thinking, oh my gosh, what if that happens to me? And under the Khalsa-Hawkins Act, I live in a single family home. I can't actually be protected by rent control at this point. But I started thinking, like, we've got to do something to protect the most, the low income and middle income workers.
Basic human needs.
Yeah.
Shelter.
But
Okay.
also, and I don't just think it's about renters. I think it's about everybody in the community because, unless we want to put our own stitches in and take our garbage to Demio Lane ourselves every single week and, fix our own Cruz.io internet when we have problems, like, we depend on middle and low income people. And I really think it's a tragedy of the commons where we all benefit by having more stable community, and yet some people are jacking up the rents and they're, exorbitant rents, and they're making a huge profit and the rest of the community suffers.
Well, it's interesting because you're also in the process of looking for housing to purchase potentially, and you're
Which-
firsthand aware now that the price of buying housing has actually gone up more quickly than the cost of renting. So everyone is feeling it, and there's this big
Sure.
panic.
And I can see,
all around.
I can see the perspective from people who own houses, because owning a house in this town is really challenging.
Yeah.
But I guess I feel like how much is enough? If you have tenants and you can pay your mortgage and you can pay your insurance and you can pay your taxes and you can set aside money for the updates and upgrades and repairs that you need to make, why do you need to double the rent next year? Like, why do you need to do that?
I think it's a lot of times it's the people coming in who bought the property and don't have the same overhead that the former landlord or property provider,
Sure.
housing provider did. And so they've got this huge mortgage
Right.
that they have to do. So it's this chain reaction.
Sure.
So everyone's in this ridiculous little boat in this wonderful paradise where everyone wants to live.
Right.
So
Well, I do think, I mean, with the high housing prices, the only people who can afford those high housing prices to purchase a house are people who are either pretty wealthy themselves or who are planning on charging high rents in order to pay the mortgage. And so I think that the issues are all connected. Like, I think it's a really big, complicated question, but I'm really interested right now in making sure that average, middle income, and low income people can stay in this community because we depend on them and we need that stability.
okay. Well, let's turn to a housing provider. So Peter, I see you a lot of times. Well, actually, I see most of you. Anytime there's a significant issue down at City Hall, you can count on seeing these guys down there, and generally me as well. So Peter, you've long time housing provider in the area and very active. How would you characterize your experience of owning housing? How do you feel like this potential rent control ordinance will impact you and more importantly, your tenants?
Well, thank you, Datta. Honestly, for me, myself, I don't think it's going to make a huge impact. I own our real estate company, and one thing that's going to be happening is there's going to be a huge amount of sales. It's already happening as a result of people disinvesting in Santa Cruz. I'm getting listings right now where people are selling the rental property because they want out of Santa Cruz.
Why specifically?
Because they feel that not only the rent control initiative, but the general tenor of the city council is very negative and is treating them like they're the bad guy, and they want to get their investment out of Santa Cruz and go to somewhere else. So for that, I'm going to actually benefit. And just like with the rental inspection program, it was a pain for me, but the net thing has been it's a benefit for me because it reduced the amount of housing and it made it much easier to find tenants. I can get better tenants a lot easier, and it drove rents up. So it was a great, the idea was to make housing safer, but the reality was it just made it more expensive.
Right.
And so with this rent control initiative, what's going to happen, just as we've already seen this in places, San Francisco, we were looking at Santa Monica, some of the places that had rent control in place for quite a while now, what we see is it reduces the supply of rentals. And that's unequivocal. Their rent control boards have statistics out actually saying that they've reduced the number of rentals. I think San Francisco is at 30% and Santa Monica is at 25%. So when everybody at this panel agrees that the obvious biggest problem we have is not enough supply of housing, I just can't see why someone would sponsor something that has been proven to actually reduce the number of rentals available. And when you reduce the number of rentals available, the people that you're hitting the hardest are honestly the people at the bottom that are barely able to get in. And so what's going to happen is a well-intended initiative, what it will do is it'll raise up the rents substantially for the units that are available, and people will be taking the rentals off the market. They're going to be selling them to owner-occupied. So people will come from over the hill with a lot of money and they'll buy the rentals up and make them owner-occupied houses, and they'll reduce the number of rentals available for people that live in our community.
Yeah, I have a couple of listings right now that resulted from that as well, and it is interesting. Similarly, they were relatively reasonable rentals, and they are, well, if the new ordinance passes, as I understand it, if somebody wants to withdraw something from the rental stock, they have to certify that they're going to do that for 10 years. Otherwise, the tenant can move back in at the rent that they were at before, right?
Right.
So, and that also transfers to the new owner. So the new owner has to abide by that as well. Is that correct?
I believe that would be the
Okay,
case.
I think that's what it said.
Yeah.
So then hypothetically, this house that was being sold, it gets fixed up. They'll put $50,000 to get, maximize their proceeds from it, and then they'll sell it to somebody who's going to owner occupy it. And the tenants who are there, I'm not sure where they're going to live because there's no housing being provided. So, does the rent control ordinance he proposed provide any housing, or is there any kind of measure? Because it talks about a 7-person rent control board, as I understand it. That would be comprised of. Can you speak a little bit about the rent control board and do you have a projected cost of what that's going to cost to administer, a budget?
Well, actually, what the Movement for Housing Justice is focusing right now is gathering signatures to get this initiative on the ballot. So I'm not really prepared tonight to discuss or have a focused discussion on the details of what will be in the ordinance. And once we get it on the ballot, then that will be the perfect time to have forums and so forth on what are the details.
But I think it's
So, but-
significant. I mean, I've heard reports, Mountain View, for example, spends $2.5 million reportedly on their rent control program annually. And it's not created, and Mountain View has seen a corresponding drop in supply, and rents starting to go up. I'd rather personally, if you're going to spend $2.5 million, hypothetically,
Right.
I'd rather see it go to housing the homeless or creating more Section 8 housing, real solutions. A place, you talked about the nurses who now live down in Watsonville. If this with the rent freeze, anybody who's lucky enough to get the low rent isn't going to move. So I don't see if there's a place to bring these nurses in or the school teachers in. So wouldn't it make more sense to spend that kind of money on transitional housing and those kinds of solutions?
Well, we're not. Nobody's claiming that the rent control ordinance would provide more housing or would create more housing. But the property owners on the panel are citing some statistics, and I've heard different statistics. I know that in Mountain View, which passed a rent control ordinance, I mean, you're just citing that. One of the major developers who spent a lot of money opposing that rent control ordinance and claimed in some of the publicity that, this is going to kill the building of any new apartments, and now they are engaged in building a lot of new apartments.
Right,
So-
because they're protected under Costa-Hawkins. But at a state level, and we're going to have to wind things up, they're talking about repealing Costa-Hawkins, and if that happens, then a builder like that, in conjunction with rent control, won't have any incentive left. So there's a lot of, I really appreciate
People
you guys.
are always going to want to come to Santa Cruz.
But they're not going to want to build here. Everyone
I
wants
have
to be here. I want to be here.
But honestly, building like a place where there's the single family homes are $3,200 for a bedroom, that doesn't do average people any good.
Yeah. Well, it's a complex issue. I think we've got a minute left. Peter, you want one final comment?
I mean, I think people are they miss sight of the fact that because the new housing is expensive, they want to say that that's not a good thing. But that new housing means that people that are coming from out of our area have somewhere to go, as opposed to displacing someone that's here already. And if it's expensive, people here already may choose to move up to nicer housing to free up housing for lower income people. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if the new housing is expensive. New housing is more housing.
So
I see people moving downward, though, not upward.
yeah. Well, again, I appreciate all of you joining. I wish we had more time. Hopefully we'll have a follow-up episode and some off-camera. Any of you who would like to discuss things off-site, maybe set up a forum of people who really care from different sides, because I don't think you get a balanced discussion unless you have a balanced sample of people. So I really appreciate all you being here, and hopefully we can make some more progress on that. Thank you all for your efforts on behalf of the community. And thank you for joining us. Hope you enjoyed this discussion, and we look forward to more of the same.